action at COPs and beyond press conference. Thank you. I'm pleased to moderate today a panel of experts on climate obstruction. Today, when we've just learned that 1 in 25 participants in this year's COP are fossil fuel lobbyists, these are the people who understand how the whole network works to obstruct climate action. I'm going to turn it right over to my colleague Timmons Roberts, who is one of the lead authors and co-editor of the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Kate and Dela especially, and Krishna, and the Union of Concerned Scientists for helping us get this press conference arranged. My name's Timmons Roberts. I'm a professor at Brown University in the United States. I'm also director of something called the Climate and Development Lab, and important for today, the Climate Social Science Network. So that's a network now of 800 social scientists around the world in 49 countries. And it has a bland name, but we're focused on who's blocking action on climate change. Our theory of change is that we are failing to act on climate change because we did not anticipate and prepare for and strategize for the obstruction, for those who would block and delay the transition that needs to happen for our species to survive. We thought that good ideas, good technology, science, and good policy would lead the way and people would just naturally make this transition, and we were wrong. So we need this much more information. So we really seek to be the sort of research capacity for the litigators, for the investigators, the policymakers, the journalists, the negotiators, and the civil society. We have 18 working groups. We do briefing papers, online events, and we do assessment volumes. We did one on Europe last year, assessment, climate obstruction in 11 countries. And we had a chapter on the European Union that we rolled out in Brussels last year. This year we did a global volume, and we have a few copies here. It's free online at the website of our organization, CSSN.org. So CSSN.org. And it's right at the top. There's summaries also that were written by journalists, so hopefully readable. We think of it like the working group 4 of the IPCC, the one that the IPCC was not able to prepare. Because, and I have huge respect for the work of the IPCC, and we in fact rely on them for sort of an understanding of what is needed to be done about climate change. But they need to tell the story without the villains, without really criticizing. And as someone said, it's like telling the story of Star Wars without mentioning Darth Vader. It makes no sense. In other words, we can't understand why we've failed so badly. So I brought in 3 co-editors, Carlos Milani, a distinguished political scientist from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Jennifer Jacquet from University of Miami, and she's my co-research director of CSSN, the Climate Social Science Network, and a specialist on agriculture. She wrote a great book called The Playbook. Christian Downey is from Australia National University from the School of Regulation and Governance. And we outlined the book. We recruited 27 lead authors. They pulled together 12 chapters, and they then recruited contributing authors to each chapter. In all, we have 110 total authors. It's a 7-page list in the book of authors. It's really a who's who in this area. The book has 5 chapters on sectors: the oil and gas sector, coal, steel, and utilities, agriculture, think tanks, PR firms, media, social media. You'll be hearing about 3 of those chapters today. There's 5 chapters on where it's happening, these sort of elements, disinformation in the global south, subnational, and at the UNFCCC. And then 2 chapters on solutions, legal and regulatory solutions, and those from non-state actors. So I really look forward to today's presser. I appreciate everybody coming, and those who are online, you can submit your questions online as well. And I'm going to hand it over to Carlos.
Thanks, Timmons, for this great introduction. My name is Carlos Milani. I'm a professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm also the director of the Interdisciplinary Observatory on Climate Change. And I'll just give to you the 10 key takeaways from this global assessment. As Timmons said, this global assessment is based on evidence, slide. We didn't create new research in order to produce this volume. The idea was to mirror the experience of the reports published by IPCC. So it's all based on evidence. So the first key takeaway, which we consider extremely important, is that climate obstruction is not just about denial anymore. Although denial is still there and sometimes being spoken by key leaders like President of the United States of America or former President of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, the strategies and the modalities of obstruction are much more sophisticated than only literal denial. I don't have the time to get into the detail. Then we can get into the detail later on during the Q&A if you want. Second key takeaway, big oil is of course a key player in obstruction, but it's not at all the only one. If you consider the situation in Brazil, for example, and if you ignore the role played by agribusiness, you're not going to understand climate obstruction, at least in the context of the Brazilian political economy. Third key takeaway, trade associations are very important agents of climate obstruction. They fund campaigns, they fund research, and sometimes they hide behind them important companies which do not necessarily appear thanks to the help and support of trade associations. Number four, networks of think tanks are spreading obstruction globally. And very often the strategies used in the US or in the UK or in Australia, they arrive here in Brazil. And it's thanks to the work of many think tanks, ultra-conservative and conservative think tanks that have been created in Brazil and in many Latin American countries and elsewhere, that these messages are circulating. The same strategies are being replayed. There is a playbook, and think tanks have a very important role in terms of spreading the word and spreading the way climate obstruction is developed globally. Number five, PR firms, public relations firms enable corporate efforts to obstruct climate obstruction. And very often we don't know much about the role of PR firms. There is a need for further research on that. Number six, and I'm going to rush, some governments have taken leading roles in obstructing climate action. We know many of them. I'm not going to get into detail. 7, obstruction occurs within multilateral governance structures. And Danielle is going to be speaking about that in a while. Number 8, national and local contexts shape obstruction, particularly in the Global South. And we do not know much about what's going on in the Global South. We have very little research on Brazil, on Argentina. By the way, we have some policy papers around which have translated some of these key takeaways in Portuguese and also summarizing climate obstruction in Brazil and in Argentina in Portuguese, addressed for media professionals here in Brazil too. Number 9, obstruction starts at the top, but requires social acceptance. And number 10, finally, this is my last key takeaway, there are efforts to address climate obstruction through mainly regulation, litigation, climate litigation, and naming and shaming by social movements. I'm going to stop here for the sake of time, and I'm going to
pass it on to Danielle Falzone from Rutgers University, the author of our In Honor chapter of about the UNFCCC, and also co-chair of our working group on the UNFCCC, and also going to talk about a working paper that's very exciting.
Thanks, Timmons. Hi, my name is Danielle Falzon, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University, and I'm a co-author on 2 of the chapters in this great volume. So first, I want to tell you more about a chapter that's extremely relevant to this venue where we're speaking from today. So chapter 10 on obstruction in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is the climate negotiations, what's happening here at COP30, and also on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the political and scientific body that kind of produces the scientific assessment reports on climate change. So early analyses of climate obstruction in these international contexts have identified strategies and tactics that countries use to obstruct. So this includes limiting the scope of an issue, perhaps by excluding it from the agenda, reducing transparency by limiting participation in meetings, manipulating language to make texts weaker or more ambiguous, and promoting non-transformative solutions like pushing conversations into lengthy work programs and out of the informal consultations. These initial studies have also identified structural factors that ensure that developed countries have significant advantages in these institutions over developing countries, and that climate denier leaders like Donald Trump and previously Jair Bolsonaro could interfere with international science and policy. In this chapter, we highlight two categories of obstruction in the UNFCCC and IPCC. So first is procedural obstruction, which targets negotiation processes with the aim of slowing down or derailing the negotiations themselves. This might look like using rules of procedure to delay or waste time in meetings, or taking over coordinating roles and other positions of power to have an outsized influence in climate decision-making. Historically, this has been a favored tactic of OPEC countries in the US. And these procedural tactics can be really difficult to spot because they operate within the rules rather than breaking the rules of these institutions. Second is substantial obstruction, which targets the substance of the negotiations, which comes up quite a bit in engagement under the IPCC, where obstructionist countries are questioning the science and conclusions of the IPCC reports. And then they come to the UNFCCC and they work to weaken decisions when these reports come out in order to preempt more ambitious climate action. This chapter also spotlights some of the major obstructionist countries, including the United States, China, Brazil, India, Russia, and the European Union. And it delves into how non-state actors have influenced these institutions, for example, as fossil fuel companies lobby delegations at the COP meetings. And to learn more about countries' obstruction here at COP30, you can read our new primer. I have copies of this on obstruction in the UNFCCC, which can be accessed also online on the Climate Social Science Network website. Already at COP30, we're seeing countries waste time by giving 20-plus minute interventions, refusing to discuss critically important issues of adaptation finance, and attempting to push off key decisions to future meetings. So this is obstruction in real time. Next, I'll move on to Chapter 11, which examines another critical issue at COP30, adaptation. The chapter is titled Obstructing Global and Local Climate Change Adaptation. And so the goal of adaptation is to reduce risk and vulnerability to climate change, strengthen resilience, enhance well-being and capacity, and the capacity to anticipate and respond successfully to change. And we know adaptation is critical for addressing the effects of climate change and safeguarding people's lives, livelihoods, and well-being. This chapter delves into how governmental, non-governmental, and private actors seek to delay and block adaptation actions at both the global and the local scales. They may obstruct because an adaptation action does not serve their interests or because it might disrupt existing power dynamics that are currently benefiting them. Globally, there is a relative marginalization and neglect of adaptation in the IPCC reports and in the UNFCCC. Now, this balance is improving in recent years, but there's much work to be done to ensure that adaptation is getting the required attention in international science and policy. Relatedly, climate finance for adaptation from donor countries in the global north has been sorely lacking, meaning countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change cannot access the resources necessary to implement adaptation actions. Locally, in this chapter, we highlight how obstruction takes place in three forms: direct conflict, agenda setting, and ideological control. First, through direct conflict, marginalized groups and non-dominant cultures are subordinated, forcibly excluded from decision-making, and their labor and resources are often extracted through adaptation projects being led by non-local actors. Second is agenda setting. Especially in the global south, political and organizational actors with their own special interests often set the agenda for adaptation. They earmark funds for activities that serve their interests, only allow discussion around issues that reflect concerns from dominant social groups and cultures, and ensure that alternative positions are only represented tokenistically. Third, ideological control is about what can be considered possible for adaptation, what is a legitimate approach to adaptation, and whose knowledge counts in adaptation decision-making. For example, traditional and indigenous forms of knowledge are increasingly recognized as providing valuable approaches to addressing climate change, yet they are often subordinated to scientific perspectives. Ultimately, the obstruction we highlight in this chapter, in all forms, at the local and global level, prevents people from being able to effectively influence adaptation strategies and outcomes and plan for their own futures. And now I'll hand it off to Max Boykoff. Oh, no, sorry.
Thank you, Danielle. That was awesome. We're going to swap the order just slightly because Joanna Setzer from London School of Economics has just arrived. Max Boykoff is from the University of Colorado and co-authored the chapter on media and public relations.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll do my best to keep my comments short and clear. My name is Max Boykoff. I'm a professor in environmental studies. I'm also a fellow in the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. And then I'm faculty executive director of a new Buckley Center for Sustainability Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. I did co-author chapter 6, which focused in on media, advertising, and public relations, along with Melissa Arancic as a co-lead author. And I really just want to focus on 3 points with the time that we have. That we focus in on mass media as purveyors of mis and disinformation, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, as part of a persuasion industry that pairs with advertising and public relations. Thank you. Through what Carlos has mentioned, Timmons, Danielle, about distraction, around diminishment of the problem itself, around effectively delaying activities and actions, and then also outright denial still exists, is particularly prominent in the United States these days. That's point one, is that this persuasion industry operates through those general tenets. Point two is that we look at media, advertising, and public relations because people rely on these sources and outlets every day to make sense of the world around them, that they're not digging into the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, Third Working Group, where I actually was a contributing author and contribute a little bit to this, but certainly not enough. But the mass media operate in the spaces every day and help make sense of what is happening in these more insular spaces of science and policy negotiations. They help shape our perception of our attitudes, perspectives, beliefs, and considerations of what we can do, how we can engage effectively. And so PR companies step in particular here to effectively glue together the relationships that link our status quo past and present to our collective futures. And so we've documented that in this chapter. We've also documented how these different actors harness the media practices, portrayals, representations to muddy the waters of public discourse, and then the channel away attention into the important dimensions of this. So false solutions standing in for solutions, shifting responsibility from corporate actors to individuals, and on, talking about the transition as being impossible or focusing in on cost. And then my third and final point is that as we widen this out and we look at the role that wittingly or unwittingly these different organizations and actors play, is that one of our top risks today has been outlined by the UN Global Risk Report is around mis and disinformation. We are terribly underprepared. There are efforts that Timmons has outlined at the top that are very disciplined, well-developed, well-staffed, and a bit like the truth itself, that while these are operating and circulating through media, advertising, and public relations all around the world, we're really still getting our shoes on in terms of being prepared to address this. And so through strategic communication, inoculation, creativity, and increased capacity in these spaces, we contribute to better understanding and then taking action based on the information around media, advertising, and public relations. Thank you.
Way to go, Max. Thank you. So we're down to our last chapter author. That is Joanna Setzer from London School of Economics, who co-chairs our accountability and law working group in Climate Social Science Network. Again, this book that we're rolling out for the people coming in late is free online at cssn.org. And you can find also there our whole list of scholars. We really want to be sort of one-stop shopping for you guys to find the people you need to answer the questions. You can also reach out to us and we'll help you find the experts. Again, there's 800 scholars in 49 countries. And Joanna co-wrote the chapter on legal and regulatory state approaches to addressing obstruction. Joanna.
Thank you. Yeah, so our chapter, I guess it's slightly different from many of the other chapters because we're not looking at one specific sector or one specific mechanism of obstruction. We're looking how law can be used both to address, so law as a mechanism to stop obstruction, and law broadly, both the regulation that exists and litigation as well as investigations. But also we acknowledge that law can be used as a mechanism for obstruction. So the chapter starts with a regulatory landscape. And here we see law as the driver for setting emission targets, but also how regulators and legislators can employ a suite of tools to increase transparency. So we look at examples of laws that exist that set those transparency rules. Now, the bulk of the chapter is really on litigation, how litigation is being used to fight obstruction. And here we have the most obvious one, which is the climate washing litigation. So what efforts have been made in courts and in administrative bodies to challenge climate washing and how successful these have been. So if you compare climate litigation, many different types, the climate washing cases have seen more success. So they're easier cases to win, and the argument is that this will help increasing transparency. Now you can ask, is this stopping obstruction? No, it's not, but it's helping with transparency. And then we look at the polluters pay cases. So how through this litigation, there is an effort to get the highest emitters to compensate for past emissions. So then moving into how law can be used as a way to create obstruction, we look at lobbying and other mechanisms that exist in Congress and also in courts that can mean harder access to justice or indeed lobbying in passing legislation. And then finally, we look at SLAPS and the anti-SG movement as also a movement of obstruction. So how, particularly in the US, we see the courts being used as a way to stop states legislating, stop companies having their ESG policies, and also how through SLAP suits, we're seeing increasingly activists, NGOs, and even scientists being threatened with the risk of being sued. So overall, that's the chapter, and happy to be here.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm going to hand it back to Kate Sell from Union of Concerned Scientists. But first, I wanted to just mention, we have these last two chapters have a number of solutions that Joanna just spoke about. But I think that we have one important step forward happening right here at this COP, which I find very exciting, which is the Global Initiative for Information Integrity on Climate Change, or GEEC, I don't know if people are pronouncing it that way. Global Initiative for Information Integrity on Climate Change, which now 13 countries have signed a declaration. And the effort is really to protect the information, the truth that underlies our need to act on climate change. Without that, we can't understand why we're doing what we're doing. It really allows others to undermine the whole effort, as Max talked about. So Kate's going to manage a little bit of questions what do we have, about 8 minutes left?
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks to the panel. When you ask your question, could you please identify your media outlet and you give us your name, please? Thank you.
Yeah, we'll start with the room, and then we have one or two from online.
Yes, please.
I'm not with the media outlet. You need this? Hi, my name is Haviland Haskell. I'm a student here researching from Colorado College, and I'm curious from Max, Professor Boykoff's perspective, just some more insights into the fact that COP30's PR firm is Edelman, which has of the largest revenue of fossil fuel, companies like that they represent. So I'm just curious for some more insights in what you've been seeing in the obstruction and kind of the narrative that they're crafting around the conference.
It's a great point. It's highly problematic. This is the way in which some of these advertising PR firms nestle their way into these proceedings themselves, naturalize themselves, consider that a normalizing feature. And so by pointing it out is perhaps shining a light on what's otherwise overlooked at these negotiations. I think I will keep my comments short there just so we allow for more questions. Happy to talk about it more.
Thank you, yes.
Sarah Hautzinger from Colorado College, and thanks so much for the presentation and the project. I couldn't overstate how important this is. I'm curious how you're conceptualizing obstructionism, especially in relationship to, on the one hand, just the collection of interested bodies trying to preserve their profits and et cetera, on the one hand, versus knowing that you're part of slowing climate action and in that sense really compromising the public good. So when do we tilt into knowing obstruction and kind of conspiracy theory work?
Yeah, so this is a tricky business. We've spent 5 years working on a definition. And so Climate Social Science Network defines climate obstruction as intentional actions and efforts to slow or block policies on climate change that are commensurate with the current scientific consensus of what's necessary to avoid dangerous human-caused interference with the climate system. So intentional, actually, we've had quite a lot of debates about whether to include the word intentional, but we're saying intentional efforts to slow or block policies on climate change. And we basically use the IPCC as our benchmark of what is the scientific consensus of what is needed to be done to protect the climate system that supports life on Earth. Now, it's extremely context specific. It depends on who the actors are. So it is quite nuanced. And nowhere else is it more nuanced than in the global South, where real human development is needed to advance human well-being. And Carlos might say a few things about that.
So we only have a few minutes. Might I direct another question actually to you, Tim, from online. This is from Aditi at Monga Bay, India. Do you see the declaration on information integrity launched at this COP having direct consequences for lobbying rules, accreditation, or transparency in future COPs?
I think this is really a big question. I mean, this is really just a set of principles, this global initiative for information integrity on climate change. How it gets worked out into practice or a series of guidelines or actions really has yet to be decided, right? And it really needs to be decided collectively. And I think it's going to, at the level of the COPs, what is acceptable behavior and what is not needs to be openly negotiated. The other point is that countries can act individually to address the issues of information integrity, and they need to, and it doesn't have to be top down.
Yeah, on this subject, I think that the case of Brazil is particularly interesting because Brazil has been one of the leaders in promoting climate integrity, about climate science and climate scientists too. Also because in Brazil we have lots of activists and scientists who have been threatened and many of them killed, dealing with human rights, environmental rights, climate politics and climate policies. So I think that this also trickles down to the role of states in terms of promoting new policies and regulations in order to make this global agenda something more tangible at the national level too.
Nice.
I think one more question. Anyone else from the room?
Any journalists who didn't give a chance to? Yeah.
For the Italian edition of Wired magazine, and I would like to ask, what's the climate, let me say, in the United States University for scientists nowadays, because they have been attacked in any sort of ways. So the golden rule of science, I remember, is a presidential decree. So what do you think about the climate, the environment in these days? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Sell with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and so many of our members are directly impacted or very concerned about what is happening to the federal scientific enterprise, not just climate science, but certainly climate science. We are concerned about, in fact, official disinformation forming US policy. And I could certainly talk to you afterwards if you'd like to learn more about our work in this area. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today. Panelists might be available outside if there are any further questions. And thank you all very much for coming.
And people can
everyone
submit more
online.
questions as well online, right?
Yes.
Thank you all for coming. And thanks to my panelists, my co-authors, and to the organizations, and to UCS, and to Dela, and you all for being here. Thanks.